Hello, my name is Casey Day. I'm a research scientist at the University of Montana, and along with my co-authors, I'm going to share with you today some of the work that we've been doing with modeling, doing simulation modeling of YY male programs to eradicate non-native brook trout. I want to acknowledge our partners and funders in these projects we've been working on. In particular, Seattle City Light has been a really great funder and partner throughout, and then a bunch of other organizations and people that have contributed to this work along the way. So from a broad perspective, the way I like to think about this modeling work is in the framework of adaptive management. If you're not familiar with adaptive management, it's been termed the learning by doing approach, where you go out into the field and apply whatever technique it is that you're interested in as sort of an experiment. And one of the facets of adaptive management is to have a model that goes along with the work in the field to help with things like identifying unknowns and reducing uncertainty. And one thing that we do in our work is we have the model inform the field work, but in turn, the field work, as we learn new things, the field work also informs the model, and you get this iterative feedback cycle between the two that we found really helpful in our work. So to jump straight to the simulation modeling framework that we're using, I don't have a lot of time to go over the simulation model because I want to get to all the results and things that we've done. But the model we use is called CD metapop. It stands for cost distance metapopulation. And the way I like to describe it is that if you think of a classic metapopulation system where you have discrete patches and then you have movement between those patches and extinction, colonization, those kind of things, we have that sort of classic system, and then we actually populate each of those populations, or what we call patches, with individuals, and then we track those individual traits. We track their genetics, their movement from patch to patch. Then we take those populated populations and we place them over the top of a spatially explicit landscape. And the landscape can have any number of factors, any number of layers to it, whether they're environmental layers like temperature or habitat quality, or they're demographic layers like carrying capacity. But there's a lot of flexibility in how you can vary the model across space. CD Metapop is quite flexible, but just to give you the basics, there are some parameters that are controlled by class, so age or stage, like fecundity and maturation. There are some that are controlled by patch, like I mentioned, carrying capacity, or factors that the environment might affect. And then there are some parameters that can be controlled by both, such as mortality, for example. You could have mortality be age-based, or you could have it be a function of the environment, maybe temperature, or you could have mortality coming from both of those. But there's a lot of flexibility in the mechanisms available to you with CD Metapop and the sort of modules that you can work with. So when we set out to build a simulation model of this YY brook trout program, I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to do it was the program was so new that there was no good data sets, no long-term data sets to guide the work. So we wanted to build a model that could help inform the field work as we were going forward. So that was the first goal. Can we make a model that does this YY system and passes Y chromosomes on to offspring and affects sex ratios and things like that? And once we did that, we wanted to investigate the ecological factors that might affect the success of a YY program, things like the fitness of the YY fish or their dispersal. And then we wanted to look at also, of course, the management factors that might affect the success of the program. So how many fish do we put out? What are the size of those fish? How much effort do we put into suppression? Things like that. So I'll go through results from those two different factors, ecological and management. And here is the study system that we simulated. This is Sullivan Creek, which is just not too far from Spokane, just a couple hours north. It's a tributary to the lower Pend Oreille River, and it's inhabited by both cutthroat trout and brook trout. And so this is where the program is ongoing. We simulated up to 100 years of treatment if brook trout were not eradicated. In tandem with outplanting of YY males, there's also suppression ongoing, so that's another source of mortality. And then we simulated a restricted dispersal scenario where basically fish are residents for the most part. Dispersal does take place, but there's no big like migration movements, things like that. And actually, before we had even conceived of building YYs into our simulation model, we developed a model of suppression of brook trout, electrofishing suppression. And I bring that up just because when we did that, our conclusion was that it would be very difficult to eradicate brook trout from Sullivan Creek, which is a pretty large system, through suppression alone. And one of the big factors in that was we saw these compensatory responses. When you reduced the population significantly in one area, that increased migration from other areas and also increased survival of smaller fish that were less affected by the suppression. Both things that we thought could potentially be counteracted with a YY program. And that was sort of the genesis originally for building the YY mechanism into the model. So I just want to run through again the various factors that we looked at across these studies, and we compared these sort of simulation experiments back to a null scenario of YY outplanting as sort of a baseline. We looked at how each of these factors affect the success of the program. So fitness in terms of competitive fitness and survival and reproductive fitness, dispersal behavior, how far and how often YYs disperse from their release location, how landscape configuration, where on the landscape does a population occur? Does that have any impact? The number and size of YY males outplanted, how much effort, how often are you going out suppressing, and what's the mortality rate associated with that suppression? And then the maturation level of the YY fish once they are outplanted. So we'll jump right into results. And the first thing I want to show is this sort of null scenario where fitness is not affected, and this follows as closely as possible to the management plan that's ongoing in Sullivan Creek. And what you're seeing is that about year 23 or so, we start electrofishing suppression, and then about 3 years later, we start YY outplantings, and that's where you see this split in male-female, and you see just a quick decline in the population until around, it's year 40, year 45, but in reality it's somewhere around between years 20 to 25 that we generally would see brook trout going extinct. And then if you look at occupancy, you can see that in the first 10 or 15 years, most of the patches on the landscape are extinct already. And there's a last few patches that generally take longer to get all the way to get those last few remaining brook trout that are hanging on. So with these figures here, I want to talk a bit about the effect of density dependence. We found that the density dependent effect of putting thousands of YY male fish into the system every year had a huge effect on mortality due to competition, density dependence. And the only difference between these two figures, what you're seeing are various treatments, and you're seeing population size of wild brook trout over time. And in the top figure, we're outplanting YY males, and in the bottom figure, we're outplanting XY males. So you wouldn't expect in that case any shifting of sex ratios in the wild population. And if you look at the sort of thick dashed line, in each of these cases, there's no suppression going on. And so if you look at this bottom figure, you can see how, with no suppression at all, how much decline in the wild population there is just due to density dependence, because there's no YY male being outplanted in that case, and it's reducing the population by almost 50%. So it's a significant portion of the mortality and shift in population size that's due just to that density dependent effect. Here we have a contour plot of fitness, and on one axis we have reproductive fitness, and on the other axis we have competitive fitness. And we ran a bunch of simulations across this landscape of varying levels of reproductive and competitive fitness. And then the color shows you how successful that simulation was in terms of eradicating brook trout. And what we noticed from this is that the simulations were, especially at high levels of fitness, they were really sensitive to higher levels of competitive fitness, in that regardless of where reproductive fitness was at, lowering competitive fitness had a strong impact on the success of the program. And then in terms of how long it took to drive the population to extinction, now the purple color is showing the longest possible time to extinction. In fact, in the darkest color, extinction never occurred. And we're seeing a similar pattern here where competitive fitness had a stronger effect on how long it would take to drive the brook trout population to extinction. And even with reproductive fitness values all the way down to 0.2, you could still get a very successful eradication program. For dispersal behavior of the YY fish, we used a number of different movement distributions, and I'm showing 3 of them here. And we've got a random movement distribution where fish just move randomly to a new location on the landscape, and then a couple of Gaussian distributions with different standard deviations, and then a Pareto distribution, which we think is probably the most likely distribution that you would see. And this is with 16 release locations across that landscape, so this number could be increased or decreased depending on how much effort the managers wanted to put into that. And we found that with really restricted movement, as you might see with a Pareto distribution, it was much more difficult to get the population to extinction, whereas with other distributions, if the fish were distributing themselves well across the landscape, you would see normal, quick levels of extinction. So remember I showed that slide earlier that looked at occupancy of patches over time, and that most patches went extinct relatively quickly, but there were a few that held on. And those patches that were harder to get to extinction had 2 things in common. One was that they were better connected to the rest of the patches. They were more centralized to more tributaries across the landscape. And the other is that they had a higher carrying capacity. And those 2 factors explain 60% of the variation in a regression, looking at how the time it took for a given patch to go extinct. So this could be important for managers to think about when they're planning their effort, to look at what are my more centralized patches and which patches are hotspots for the non-native species. So now we're moving on to the more management factors that we varied in trying to eradicate the wild brook trout population. And what you're seeing here is, again, time to eradication on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you're seeing basically how many individuals, YY individuals, you're outplanting each year. And what you're seeing with this relationship is once you hit a number of individuals that's equal to about 80% of the age 1+ population size, you don't get much benefit beyond that by outplanting more and more YY males. We didn't see that same pattern with the catchable size YY males that were more like 250 millimeters. In fact, the y-axis here is minimum number of females observed, because we had a really hard time getting the population to actually go extinct with catchable YY males. And this raised an interesting question. Why were we seeing better success with putting more fingerling YY males out when none of these are mature, as opposed to all these catchable YY males with lots of maturity? Is there some role of inter and intra-cohort competition going on? So I wanted to look into this question of inter-cohort competition a little further. And so I looked at survival of different age classes. You've got age on the x-axis here and survival of wild brook trout on the y-axis. And there's a lot going on here, but what I want to focus in on is this area right here, ages 2 to 4. When we used fingerling YY males, there was a lot more competitive effect, a lot lower survival on these younger size classes than when we used catchable YY males. And that was the difference. Remember earlier how I mentioned how strong the effect of density dependence alone was in reducing the brook trout population. I think this sort of validates that point, in that when we used catchable YY males, there was almost no extra mortality on these middling sort of age classes, and you don't see that effect until you get to the upper age classes, which was the upper limit of the brook trout that we simulated. We also looked at electrofishing effort and the role of suppression. And so here you have, again, years to extinction on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have percent mortality as a result of electrofishing. So you could think of that as, more passes in a given reach. And so clearly time to extinction decreases as mortality increases. And then we looked at a bunch of different possible schedules for suppression. And as you might expect, as you increase more and more suppression, more often you see a lower time to extirpation, although suppression every year did not seem to do any better than 5 years on, a cycle of 5 years on and 2 years off. Finally, we looked at the maturity rate of the YY males that were outplanted, and this was almost an afterthought until we started getting reports back that some proportion of the YY males being outplanted were indeed mature. And so we said, yeah, let's look at that and see, can this be manipulated, in the hatchery to produce more mature fish in the stream. And as you might guess, it does have a strong effect on how long it takes for a population to get extinct as the proportion of individuals that are mature increases. Although once you get to about 50 to 75%, again, we don't see much improvement, and that may just be due to the sheer volume of individuals that we're putting in. In this figure, you're seeing the size of the wild brook trout population over time in the red and blue, and I want you to look at the number of mature YY males over time that are available for breeding when you have 50% mature YY males in the system, which is the dotted green line, versus 0%. And you see the dotted line, like look at the blue line is the number of females, the dotted line is decreasing much faster, much earlier than the solid line, and that's solely due to increasing the maturity of the YY males that are outplanted. So to sort of recap a lot of these results that I've shown, I know it was a lot, and one thing I want to emphasize is that we don't look at these simulation outcomes as sort of a crystal ball, like, oh, if you do this, you'll eradicate in 10 years, and if you do this, you'll eradicate in 20. Rather, we're looking at relative outcomes and the strength of effects. How strong is the effect of increasing maturity? Is it worth doing? How strong is the effect of increasing effort and suppression? Is that worth doing? Where can managers put their time, money, and effort based on model outcomes? And so given that, I think there are a few things that are important to think about from the simulation results. One is that the distribution of the MYY fish, the YY males across the landscape, was important. And maybe that's something we need to collect more data on, is how well, immediately after dispersal, when it's time for breeding, spawning season, how well are the YY males distributing themselves throughout the stream system? What other parameters do we need to learn more about in the field that can go and improve the performance of the model, so that the model can then improve its predictions and help guide the field work? I think we've shown that density dependence is a really important factor in this work, and we need a better understanding of the role of competition in causing eradication of brook trout in these systems, and it's not only reliant on shifting sex ratios. And I think we've also shown that management strategy and effort can go a long way in reducing treatment time. So we have a number of other applications that we're working on that still include YY fish, and one of these is a multi-species version of CD Metapop, which is pretty much ready to go at this point. And we're going to be able to simulate cutthroat trout and brook trout simultaneously in the same simulation and model competition across species in that way. And we're really excited about that. Kaylee Davenport, a graduate student at the University of Montana, also has an application going with brook trout looking at recovery, changes to brook trout populations and their recovery times given a failure to eradicate. Would the resulting brook trout population be suppressed? What would its fitness look like? Things like that. So that's another ongoing application that we're looking forward to from Kaylee. If you've made it this far in the talk, I'll say thank you so much for listening and have a great day.